Good evening, everyone. I'm Noah Albaum. I am the program coordinator for the Jewish Community Library, which is a program of Jewish Learning Works. I want to welcome you to this evening's presentation on Dybbuks, Robots, and Golems, exploring Jewish science fiction and fantasy with Valerie Frankel. The Friends of the Jewish Community Library help make this program and so much of what we do possible. I hope you'll consider supporting the library by becoming a friend at www.friendsofthejcl.org. Before we begin, some quick notes. Automated closed captioning can be accessed by clicking the CC button at the bottom of your screen and selecting Show Subtitles. You can also turn subtitles off by clicking on the CC button and choosing Hide Subtitles. Because we have a large number of attendees, everyone will be muted during the program except for our presenter. There will be an opportunity for questions and answers at the end of the program, and you can feel free to put your questions in the chat at any time. I will relay them to our presenter, time permitting. Valerie Estelle Frankel is the author of more than 80 books on pop culture. Many of her books focus on women's roles in fiction, from her heroines' journey guides from Girl to Goddess and Buffy and the Heroine's Journey to books like Super Heroines and the Epic Journey and Women in Game of Thrones. She is the editor of the academic series Jewish Science Fiction and Fantasy and is the author of Jewish Science Fiction and Fantasy through 1945. Her 2019 children's book, Helm for the Holidays, was a PJ Library selection. Formerly a lecturer at San Jose State University, she now teaches at Mission College and San Jose City College and speaks often at conferences. This program is part of the library's One Bay One Book program, a year-long conversation connecting Bay Area readers through discussions, events, and informal conversations centered around a single title and its themes. This year's One Bay One Book selection is The Hidden Palace, a novel by Helene Wecker centered around two mythical creatures trying to pass as human on the Lower East Side of Manhattan at the turn of the 20th century. We are truly fortunate to have Valerie here with us today, as she is one of today's most prolific authors on science fiction and fantasy genres. Thank you so much, Valerie, for being with us.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for coming. Nice turnout. All right, let me just share the inevitable PowerPoint. And yes, the slides are on my website. Links before, links after. Well, I'll post some links right after the PowerPoint, I guess, but I will give you the link to my website, including this presentation. All righty. Dybbuks, Robots, and Golems, exploring Jewish science fiction and fantasy. And yes, apologies if I leave out your favorite work of all time, but we are going to be going speedily through 100 years of history. So we are hitting the highlights, including all the ones in our little intro paragraph. And off we go. All right. Science fiction really had to wait until we had enough science to make fiction with. Certainly, we can go back thousands of years and find space travel adventures and so forth, but an awful lot of our scholars would agree that science fiction begins around the Industrial Revolution with Frankenstein, or with Jules Verne and H.G. Wells, or authors round about this time. So I wanted to give us that history and also mention that the first Hebrew novel, The Revealer of Secrets, comes out right around this time. And our hero, it's a satire, it's mocking the government and all kinds of things and the religious split. And our hero is running around with basically an iPad recording what everybody's up to. So we even get science fiction a little bit in the first Hebrew novel. And this is happening around the time of the Haskalah, which is the Jewish Enlightenment. And we didn't necessarily have Jews writing large amounts of science fiction then, but we had Jews going a lot more secular and starting to publish science articles, more magazines, more newspapers, more moving to the big city and moving in with the locals. And all of this is changing the culture very much. So this is kind of our prologue to the story. And then we've got the golem, which I'm sure we all knew was coming somewhere in this presentation. We do have all kinds of evidence that Frankenstein was inspired at least somewhat by the golem, and that the Shelleys did have folklore books that covered the golem out of course, Jewish folklore. And then World War I came along, and there was a best-selling novel called The Golem by Gustav Meyrink, and World War I was the time when technology absolutely seemed to be running amok. There was all kinds of tanks, aircraft, machine guns, and people were asking the questions about what do we do when the technology is starting to take over and control us instead of the reverse. Well, this novel isn't about that, but it really touched on that enough metaphorically that everyone was reading this novel, and it was such a bestseller at the time. And that inspired the Golem movies being made in Europe at the time, of which we have limited surviving amounts of. And that's when the Golem really entered pop culture. Nowadays, golems are in D&D, golems are in all kinds of mainstream fantasy, Pokemon, but this is where they really entered the mainstream. By the way, I probably will not be monitoring the chat through all this, but if you would like to put your comments, your recommendations, your favorite Jewish things in the chat, please do, for the enjoyment of everyone else anyway. Oops. All right. After World War I, we're in the interwar period, and we've got Kafka writing his stuff. And Kafka was Jewish. He did not write a lot about Judaism. There was one short story with a synagogue in it, I think. But he's writing about alienation. He's asking questions like, what do you do if you're going about your ordinary day and suddenly everyone's pointing at you and saying, oh my gosh, it's a cockroach. We don't want you around anymore. Go hide in your room and pretend you don't exist. Get out of our space. So in his stories about the grotesque, the monstrous, alienation, being pushed aside, we really get this Jewish metaphor, even if he wasn't being explicit about it. Another work from this time, which is over in our far corner, is Bambi. The author was an Austrian Jew, Felix Salten, and all right, I know we've all seen the Disney and probably have not read the novel, fair enough. Walt Disney took all this out, but if you read the novel, it ends up being a heavy allegory about how the humans are discriminating against and mistreating the animals, and how much this stinks, and how much Europe is turning into this violent, horrible place. And in fact, Salten wrote a whole shelf of animal books, and one of them, Hound of Florence, inspired the Shaggy Dog, so Walt Disney went there twice. But I was thumbing through these things actually this afternoon at the library. Mountain View Library had a complete set. And there are all these parables, all these moments of, yeah, I really wish the humans would stop being so cruel to us, where you can really see the rise of fascism in Europe and these authors protesting however they could. And we've got non-Jewish authors like the Capek brothers around this time who wrote about a number of Jewish characters. They're most famous for inventing the term robot. And again, we see them fighting fascism as they're writing in Czechoslovakia. All right. We are now moving to America, which is actually where we're spending most of this presentation, because we are launching American science fiction. Now, before this, we had Jules Verne and H.G. Wells, yes, but they're off to the center of the earth and firing a rocket ship out of a giant cannon and kind of suspect science. We might even call those adventure pulps. and adventure pulps were quite big at the time. But then we have Hugo Gernsback, a Jewish Belgian immigrant who is often called the father of science fiction. And he was an actual inventor who liked real science. In fact, his electronics-based short story, Ralph 12 4C 41 Plus, actually predicts the invention of these things that had not been invented yet: microfilm, vending machines, tape recorders, synthetic fibers, the jukebox, the television, satellites, and spaceflight. And even though radar hadn't been invented yet, he put in a blueprint for radar too. So this was a radically new kind of science fiction that was based in cutting edge science or near future science. So he launched Amazing Stories magazine, and it took off. And then there were many other science fiction magazines that followed, and many other Jewish publishers that he trained and who took over for him on these magazines, who were heading off all these new science fiction magazines. And this was really the birth of the genre. Connected with these, there were science fiction publishers. There was a science fiction literary agency. We had the first fanzines. We had the first science fiction clubs. And this was all in New York. And they were all working together, spinning off each other and creating the science fiction genre. And yeah, they were not 100% Jews, but there was a very large Jewish population here. Conventions started at this time. 1938, Sam Moskowitz chaired the first science fiction convention, and the year after that, you can see World War II is on the horizon, is Worldcon, which has been held pretty consistently to today, including during COVID, sort of. We went online. But we also had split in science fiction fandom going back to this time, because the Futurians, who were more the radical political side, weren't being allowed to go to the convention. We also have cosplay going back to around this time. So of course, as we make all these magazines, we have the authors filling them up. Here were the Jewish science fiction authors from this time. They weren't making a lot of Jewish characters. There are one or two Jewish last names on the characters, but at the time, Jews were really trying to blend in, not stand out, assimilate, join the American dream. But we absolutely have characters fighting fascism. We have satires of fascism. We have mutants and aliens pleading for tolerance. You can absolutely see some Jewish sensibility going on in these stories as we're in this interwar period. And of course, reprints, you can get so many of these stories now. Isaac Asimov is launching his career around this time as a rather young man. His 3 Laws of Robotics ended up fueling so many robot stories that we have today. And it's based in golem logic of how do you keep the creature from running amok. And it's also our Talmudic precepts of prioritizing life above following orders. He wrote the Foundation trilogy, which was just on TV. And in it, the planet Rossum is his parents' Jewish Russia. And we've got Yiddishisms. We've got the people of the book keeping the society alive. We've got all that kind of stuff as they're preserving the lore in a crumbling world. And Asimov's science fiction magazine is named for him. We start Jewish underdog comedy around this time. Now, we launched science fiction, pretty much run by Jews at the time, and of course the movie industry is also happening, and so are the comic books. Why did so many Jews join these 3 industries? Well, the answer isn't that great. The answer is because so many Jews were prohibited from working in so many established industries that really did turn Jewish people away. So these few industries that were not just brand new, but also run by Jews were willing to hire Jews. So people who wanted to actually make money to live on, and in those days you could live on short story sales, out they went. So we've got comic books starting, including Yiddish comics, and we've got our friends Bugs Bunny and Betty Boop here. Bugs Bunny is voiced by Mel Blanc and is absolutely a Brooklyn Bronx type with some Jewish mannerisms, and he is outwitting bullies who are Southern and Western stereotypes, not coincidentally. The Fleischer brothers are busy running a studio that's basically the big competitor to Disney at the time. I could do a whole thing on Disney. I have limited time, another time on Disney. But anyway, the Fleischer brothers are their big competitor, and they're doing Betty Boop, they're doing Popeye. Betty Boop is voiced by Mae Questel, who's from Jewish vaudeville and is bringing that sensibility to the character. They're doing Superman cartoons. And speaking of Superman, comic books are launching at this time. What did Jews invent? Comic books themselves, DC, Superman, Batman, the Spirit, Captain America, Green Lantern, Black Canary, and all of their, Lois Lane and the Joker and Catwoman and all the related characters. Yes. And there are many nonfiction books about this that have been coming out lately, if you're curious. World War II has not quite happened yet, but as things are getting worse, Hitler is in power, the US is not yet joining the war, the comic book creators, who again, mostly Jewish, struck back the only way they could and sent in Captain America and Superman to show what they thought of Hitler and what they thought of fascism. And you do get this metaphor for both characters who are both skinny, wimpy, glasses wearing in Superman's case. They look like you could beat them up on the street and they're just trying to blend in and not cause any trouble. But if you look closer, there's a superhero underneath, with Kal-El having a rather Hebrew sounding name, and they have powers if you look closer and could be incredibly strong under the surface, but everybody just overlooks them as total wimps. So again, the creators were fighting back however they could. World War II happens. A lot of the creators go off to war. The comics hire a lot of women. Some of the short story writers and comic writers were sending in their stuff from World War II. There are many fascinating stories. And of course, World War II ends and Israel is founded. I wanted to mention that Israel may be the only country on earth founded based on a fantasy novel, which is, of course, Herzl's Old New Land. If you read it, it is available online. He constructs a rather Germanic utopia with lots of opera houses and elevated trains and so forth, where everybody lives in peace, but this dream was used to inspire the land of Israel finally being founded. So now, of course, we're in the post-Holocaust period, and we knew Spock was coming, obviously, but I wanted to get in some other characters too. So we have Spock, who is the outsider on the bridge. All the humans good-naturedly make fun of him and his strange rituals. And, there's an awful lot of racist jokes against Vulcans in this show. And yes, it's all in good fun, but he really does come across as the outsider character. And we know the history of the Vulcan salute from the Kohanim. What we might not know is that when Leonard Nimoy was directing Star Trek III, he said that he wanted Vulcan to look like Israel, ancient Israel. And so we get the robes and the decor, and we're getting some vibes from there. At the bottom, I've got the episode, The Conscience of the King, which was the Eichmann trial episode, which was the hot thing going on in pop culture right then. It is absolutely about what do we do with the trial of a war criminal from 20 years ago? Do we just let it go? Do we not let it go? Will it bring peace? Will it bring revenge? And we discover that Kirk, who, yes, played by a Jew, we've presumably heard that one, was a survivor of this massacre and is feeling more than a little ticked off about it. And up top, we've got Star Trek V. And what I love about Star Trek V, an odd sentence in itself, is that you see Kirk and Spock arguing with God, not really God, as they're pointing out the flaws in his great design, as he says. And that's just a great moment when you consider that they're Jewish on some level. In some of the novels, Spock's human mother has been declared Jewish, but the novels aren't really canon, etc. So we end up with these symbolically Jewish characters, but not directly. To go more direct, Twilight Zone. In an era when nobody was ready to talk about the Holocaust yet, nobody was ready to make Holocaust TV episodes, absolutely the Twilight Zone, Rod Serling was Jewish and definitely wanted to directly address it. We also get lots of episodes about mob violence. Doctor Who. Doctor Who is invented by Sidney Newman and Verity Lambert, yes, both Jewish. And when you think about it, not only is he an exile who has lost his home and is stuck wandering the galaxy, unable to get back to his homeland, whether that's Europe or way, way back Israel, but he's also a trickster who relies on talking his way out of things, ducking authority, challenging authority, but not through violence. And yeah, the Daleks are Nazis, but that seems to be coming from a more British sensibility. Again, massive things have been written on the concept of the Daleks as this Nazi advancing army, about as much has been written on stormtroopers. So we're getting a lot of Jewish metaphors again. 2001, A Space Odyssey, Kubrick tended to actually remove Jewish characters from the novels he adapted into movies. But we're still getting, in this one, pyramids, the Cain and Abel story, lots of patterns of four, which really are seen in the Bible. And of course, Hal is this nasty golem run amok that they can't turn off. And Dr. Strangelove, of course, we're doing the fascism and post-fascism issues we're dealing with. So now we're in the Silver Age of comic books, which is the 60s, and invented by Jews, or more specifically, pretty much Stan Lee and Jack Kirby for just about everything on this list. Marvel Comics, Spider-Man, Fantastic Four, X-Men, Daredevil, Hulk, Iron Man, Thor, Nick Fury, Silver Surfer, Doctor Strange, Black Panther, all the Avengers. And over at DC, we've got Justice League and Teen Titans. And again, all the nemesis and sidekicks and stuff. There are a few Golem comics. Hey, he's copyright free, let's throw him in there. The Hulk and the Thing have been compared to golems. The characters aren't overtly Jewish, but the X-Men work as all kinds of minorities. And Spider-Man is dealing with all kinds of survivor guilt as he goes around. Spider-Man, many people say, is Stan Lee's biographical character, whereas the Thing out of Fantastic Four is Jack Kirby's biographical character, and you can see a lot of their personality in both. Another thing happening at the time is the great Jewish novel has started. Jews are entering pop culture. Barbara Streisand, Sandy Koufax, The Diary of Anne Frank, the play, is an absolute blockbuster. So we're really seeing this new trend where we're getting Jewish characters for pretty much not the first time ever, but they're really coming into pop culture. And around this time, of course, there's a big boom in Jewish comedy. And yes, Woody Allen and Mel Brooks are not known for sci-fi fantasy specifically, but they did get a few in there. And the humor we're seeing at this time is very self-deprecating, goofy humor. Again, it's the Woody Allen, Mel Brooks type of, I'm going to say something very stereotypical about myself before somebody else says it. But we've got other stories happening, other silly movies, Little Shop, Schlock, which is a Bigfoot story, Genghis Khan, the entertainer gets revenge on his Nazi murderer by entering him as a Dybbuk. And Fearless Vampire Killers is one of those movies where we get to do the, your cross won't work on me shtick. So we're making inroads there. And with the great Jewish novel becoming a thing, we start to have explicitly Jewish science fiction. I was actually expecting a lot more recommendations going nuts in the chat, as you guys will. It's evening, we're tired. We just had a holiday weekend. Anyway, Wandering Stars tends to be the first book everybody mentions to me, which was the first anthology of Jewish science fiction, followed by more Wandering Stars. And of course, the authors were writing other stuff around the time. We've got Cynthia Ozik's Golem novel. We've got Alfred Bester's Golem novel. We've got Peter S. Beagle starting his story in a Jewish graveyard. We've got The Time-Traveling Tzaddik. We've got Jews in the Future. Yeah, we're really entering Jewish science fiction. And again, there are so many books that I left out because clearly they won't all fit on the screen, but there are so many happening at this time. We've got some more surprising Jewish moments in pop culture. Here is Fozzie Bear, who is, many say, very Borscht Belt in his entertaining style, pulling a rabbi out of the hat. Why not? Mad Magazine, yes, started by Jews, has always done this ongoing gag with what if Superman were Jewish? Where the Wild Things Are, Maurice Sendak, if you look closely at his story, there's a lot of orphans and refugees and lingering questions about where the parents are. Whereas Where the Wild Things Are, many know, was written about his hairy, kissy, giant relatives who kept saying, "Ooh, we love you, we're going to eat you up," something that he channeled and put in this beloved picture book. Again, you can get whole books on Maurice Sendak and his Jewish lens for the world. And as we're getting into late 70s, 80s, we've got more Jews in pop culture, don't we? We've got Princess Bride, Jewish author, some symbolically Jewish characters, pretty much the whole cast. Raiders of the Lost Ark, yes, we know all about what Lost Ark that is. That is Darth Vader's breastplate up close and personal. Surprise, surprise. Yes, that is Hebrew. And if you can Google this, if you listen carefully in the Ewok movie, you can hear shofar sounds, also in Planet of the Apes. And we've got another one of the vampire stories with the few Jewish jokes that we can throw in there. Superheroes. Suddenly we're doing a ton of explicitly Jewish characters arriving in superhero comics. And we've got other characters who existed already, but around now, the 80s, start saying, yes, I've always been Jewish, sure. The most memorable one of these is Magneto, where Chris Claremont took Stan Lee's rather boring magnet villain and said, what if he's so determined to have mutant supremacy and mutant power because he's a Holocaust survivor and watched his people be slaughtered for being minorities? And we know how that's turned out. That was in 2 of the X-Men movies. It was considered such an important point there. And all these other characters, again, already existed, but the writers, often Jewish, took a look at their names or their personalities or something like that and said, you know, maybe he's always been Jewish. And yes, Moon Knight is about to be a Disney Plus Marvel TV show. I am guessing he won't be Jewish in that because they've got so many other things going on with him, but in the comics he is, and the son of a rabbi, I believe. 90s, we're getting a lot of token Jewish characters. We're doing a lot of the Golem episode, which is what we're seeing in X-Files there, but there are so many shows that do the Golem episode. I made a list and it's just enormous. And yes, usually with Jewish people summoning the Golem. On the bottom, we've got Xena doing the David and Goliath episode. She also did a 10 Commandments episode. And we end up with a lot of characters who are Jewish, fitting into a more multicultural team, but they're often not doing a lot with it. Willow on Buffy is famous for saying a lot that she celebrates Hanukkah, but we really don't see her doing much that's Jewish. Though if you look really close on that grave, you can see that she put a stone on it. So, teeny bit. Ivanova on Babylon 5 does a lot more with her Judaism and has several really important episodes about it. On the bottom, we can see Worf has been raised by Theodore Bickel, and you can get so much fan fiction online about how he must have celebrated the Jewish holidays while living on Earth as a young Klingon. Sure. And up on the far left, we've got the Solomon family in Third Rock from the Sun, and they are aliens trying to blend in, and to do this, they declare that they are Jewish, which is rather a backwards metaphor for so many of the outsider families like the Addams family and the Munsters from the 50s, who many say had a bit of a Jewish vibe going on or other outsider vibe, and they were trying to be as mainstream as possible. Well, the Solomons decide they must be Jewish and throw in an awful lot of Jewish jokes, and off they go. We keep telling our own stories. We've got the Hebrew Hammer up top in a delightful Jewsploitation movie that is quite funny and quite R-rated. We have Mouse that has been striking so much controversy lately. There's Fievel, who did get to star in his, not Disney, but Disney competitor trilogy of movies as he moves from Russia to the US to have a world where they won't be subjected to basically pogroms. And then at the bottom, we've got a lovely series about Supergirl, written by Peter David, where she discovers the path to become an angel, and we've got a lot of Jewish theology and Jewish storytelling here. And it was quite cool, as are so many of these. We're doing serious stories. This is Magneto and Kitty Pryde at a Holocaust memorial. We've got silly stories because, again, Mad Magazine and parodies like that are still at it, SNL, all these things. We've got so much more of the original Jewish fiction. So many different things. We've got parodies. I love Esther Frasner. We've got Israeli mercenaries in space. We've got Holocaust fairy tales. Briar Rose by Jane Yolen is very famous. We've got total humor, Mike Resnick. We've got Jewish characters going onto the fantasy world. And the two bottom middle, we are developing Israeli science fiction and fantasy. The fantasy tends to be quite urban and magical realism, where we're going along in the ordinary world and then death walks up or something. And the science fiction is often dystopian and likewise very realistic. The Road to Ein Harad, however we pronounce that, is one of the what if Israel lost the war stories, I believe the most popular of them, which of course became an entire genre. Whereas Sea Under Love is a story of a Scheherazade character in the Holocaust trapped with his Nazi nemesis, and it was just an amazing giant novel, highly recommended, and heavily magical realism. And today we've got hot vampires and superheroines, and yes, these characters have all identified as Jewish. Batwoman had a quick bat mitzvah episode, and Harley Quinn had a quick go home to her Jewish parents episode. The movie Harley Quinn has not identified as Jewish. Shadowhunters, the TV show, movie, books, has a hot teen Jewish vampire who is struggling with this concept on so many levels because he is quite religious. And in the books, there is a heartbreaking scene when the mother is trying to ward him off and puts every Jewish symbol from tefillin to the Seal of Solomon all over her door, and it works. And in the TV show, there's one where he's trying to hide his vampire nature, but he has to go home for Yom Kippur because it's Yom Kippur. And there's a lot of atonement discussion. Judah, the Israeli show on Hulu, is asking the theological questions of how do we make a Jewish vampire work. And from the theology perspective, it is amazing and fascinating. And yes, I am aware that Jews are forbidden to eat blood and we're forbidden to desecrate dead bodies. So pretty quickly, the Jewish vampire thing falls apart, but lots of authors are having fun with it. Kids' books are absolutely booming now. And again, too many to even mention, so I threw in some of my favorites. The Blue Thread, she has a magic talit that helps her time travel, and off she goes. Book one of a trilogy. The Second Mango, let's go to a fantasy world that's half Sephardic and half Ashkenazi, and let's ride dragons with our girlfriends and just be in this wonderful teen. It's just like candy. It's just so sweet and fun. The Golem and the Genie, I feel like we've heard about that as it's, our the sequel is our local hot book the Bay Area is reading. The Way Back, let's do all the Jewish folklore is real and it's terrifying in a Tim Burton, Neil Gaiman kind of way, and out we go into it with a magic spoon of death. You just got to read this thing. Hirvel, she is Orthodox. She celebrates Shabbat. She eats kugel. She wears floor-length dresses, and she also has a magic sword and fights demons, but not on Saturdays. And The Unfinished Corner just came out, and this thing, I just thought it was amazing. Let's take our Hebrew school buddies and go into Jewish fantasy land. We're wandering the desert with Miriam. We're meeting the angels and demons. We're interacting with biblical Jewish fantasy space. And we're dealing with the Kabbalistic unfinished corner left for humanity to finish. So again, that one was just wonderful. And it's just a few months old, I think. Adult fantasy is doing great too. And again, too many trillion to mention. I like fairy tales. Spinning Silver and Sisters of the Winter Wood were both delightful fairy tale adaptations. We've got science fiction. We've got some really thoughtful science fiction that's asking the social questions and the Jewish questions. We're starting to do LGBTQ, amazing Jewish fantasy. Yeah, so many good books. I mean, I'm looking at this list going, wow, I left off 12 more pages, but I'm going to give you guys the good list in a minute. And again, these slides, anthologies are booming. Some people are filling up the chat. That's awesome. Please do fill up the chat. Again, there's so many recommendations. So yeah, all these anthologies are quite recent. Zion's Fiction and Zion's Fiction 2 are doing Israeli science fiction, which makes a great, sampler for everybody. Jews versus aliens and Jews versus zombies, because somebody wanted to. We're doing Jewish Book of Horror. Throughout history, there has not been a lot of Jewish horror. Jews really have not wanted to go there. But this collection really feels original as it does go there, as they say things like, okay, who wants to write a horror Passover story? Go. The punchline was, let all who are hungry come and eat, in a truly creepy fashion. Yeah. So again, there's some delightful stuff right on the edge of coming out. Criticism is coming out. As we said earlier, I'm editing Jewish science fiction analysis, and our second book is the middle one, Let's Analyze Goliath Stories. As I said, there's so many analysis of the superhero stories. People are doing lots with Holocaust movies, lots of analysis. And if anyone wants to contact me privately after this, I'm happy to give you lists and recommendations. I mean, I will in the next 10 minutes or whatever, but And to end off, yes, I have written, as you'll see, it goes through 1945. That's because the other books are coming. This is a very big project. It is currently 500,000 words, which is 5 books. So only book 1 has been published yet, but I am working on it. And you can look up my name, Valerie Estelle Frankel. And I guess I will leave us with some links, although I'll put these in the chat. Having fun with screen sharing. Because yeah, we've got the big list of the giant science fiction list, which is hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, and I would just recommend that to everybody who would like all the books. And we've got my website where I've been putting the comics and movies and other things. And there's a link to my academic series too, which has just 2 books right now, but we are putting out more. And since I just pasted those in the chat, I guess I don't need to keep sharing them, but I would be happy to take some questions and discussion now.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Valerie. We've certainly gone through a lot. Okay, so folks, feel free to put your questions in the chat, and I'll start with what we have already. So someone asks, do you include paranormal themes as being part of science fiction or as a separate genre?
Yeah, I mean, does a library agree? Maybe, maybe not, but absolutely, and absolutely, it's out there. An awful lot of mainstream books actually do have like a ghost or an angel or something.
Let's see. Yes,
Don't
we
answer
will
the
be
chat.
sending an email with all of the links in the chat. So Rachel Bloom asks, what is your favorite science fiction with Jewish themes and or Jewish author?
The last few pages were my top 20 or so of recent ones. Yeah, I've really been enjoying the big Jewish fairy tale adaptations. These slides are currently on my website, and I put the link in the chat, and we could do a direct link. They're also on SlideShare.
Great. I was wondering if you wanted to talk a little bit more about the big themes that have motivated each era of writing of science fiction and fantasy among Jews. So you mentioned, like, starting with Kafka, like the sense of isolation and oppression, and being the outsider. And I wondered if you wanted to elaborate on that a little bit more and about how it's evolved over time.
I was definitely noticing a lot of stuff. So much that I grouped my book by eras and themes and so on. Because in the 60s, along with the self-deprecating humor, there was also 60s, 70s, even 80s, a really big trend to put the Jews on the fantasy adventures, but we ended up being the comic sidekicks or something. If you've read or watched The Last Unicorn, we're Schmendrick. And again, it seems to be playing off this self-deprecating, this we don't feel 100% like we're part of the great fantasy epic, but we kind of want to start going in it. And maybe 10 years ago, there was this famous essay about why isn't there a Jewish Narnia? And so many people responded to it with, yes, there is. I could think of 10 great Jewish Narnias. But what it meant was a real fantasy world with a very Jewish sensibility to it in the way that Narnia has a Christian sensibility to it. And I would go with there weren't that many, or they were historical fiction or this or that, or we were in real world. But the last 10 years, I have absolutely seen so many people like the author of The Unfinished Corner, or even Shadowhunters, if you use a little imagination and look at how many Jewish demons and Jewish Bible quotes are in that one. And you really do see authors saying, I want to create a Jewish fantasy land. And I'm feeling like that's connected to the fact that Jews by this point are probably fourth generation Americans. They're feeling more comfortable, more settled, just more comfortable being completely overt in the Jewish stories, and out we go. Whereas the 80s, so many, and 90s, so many of the big TV shows that had Jewish characters were non-Jewish creators. But now I really feel like Jews are doing the own voices thing, coincidental with the own voices movement.
Great, thank you. Okay, so a question from Barry about the Vulcans and the Romulans, and whether you consider them as Jews and Muslims on their way to reuniting.
I have written things about bits of Judaism in the Vulcans, but I had never thought of Romulans as Muslims. I could take a look at that, but I'm not sure the metaphor is going to hold up, whereas the Bajorans have been written about very much as being either or both of those. I'll take a look, but I'm not sure that metaphor is going to work out.
Have you, this is from Ray Manella, have you noticed diaspora as a theme in Jewish science fiction and fantasy? And if so, are there any recommendations that come to mind?
So much. Doctor Who, Asimov, you've got a lot of we want to get back to the sacred land, or, you know, Guy Gavriel Kay, who is Jewish, lots of people see his book Tigana as very much a metaphor for the treatment of the Jews in exile. His fantasy characters are under a curse where they can't even say the name of their homeland. And lots of people see stuff going on.
Thank you for elaborating on that. Have you noticed any heroine's journey themes in Jewish science fiction? And that question is from Rachel Bloom.
I've got a friend writing an essay on the Jewish heroine's journey, and we've been talking about that together and asking questions about prophecy, about Jewish values out of the Bible. So I would say there are a lot of characters out of Shadowhunters fairy tale adaptation, stuff I've already mentioned, that are absolutely going on a heroine's journey, which is one of the big things I write about. And again, if they're using Jewish ethics, Jewish sensibility, Jewish motivations. I was just reading Spinning Silver, where she's trapped in the underworld and says, okay, I need to celebrate Shabbat now. Make it work for me or else. So you absolutely do get the combination of concepts, but that's pretty recent, I'd say.
What about Neil Gaiman, Jim Clark's If You found many Jewish themes in his work.
Yes, but I kind of had to go in with tweezers and pry them out one by one, because his big system can be very dualistic. The minute you've got fallen angels and the devil and Lucifer, you're in a Christian space. But when you look at him retelling the Adam and Eve story with Lilith and with the people being connected at their backs and being broken apart at the beginning of time, you do see a more Jewish sensibility. So I can absolutely see his Hebrew school upbringing playing in. And he's also written a few things about his family, metaphorically speaking, putting characters from his family in the stories, and those I see. And just in Sandman, there were more incidentally Jewish characters than you often get in fantasy. So yes, and I've written a bit on this, but small amounts.
Any thoughts on The Phantom Toll Booth as a Jewish young adult story? Muggy the Eli Reamer asks.
I haven't read that since I was a child, so I have no thoughts on that, but that is going on my reading list. I'm sure we're all busy taking notes for our reading list. And again, I recommend the giant list I posted, but I'll have to look into that. So if you want to email me in a month. If anyone knows things that I clearly have not thought of, go nuts.
I was wondering, because we're so focused in our programming this year on the Hidden Palace and the Golem and the Jinni, and I'm wondering if you have thoughts about the theme of trying to hide one's mythical creature identity or superhero identity as a Jewish theme.
Yeah, absolutely. And you see this more from the era Superman was written. And of course, we've got whole eras. I didn't get that much into Europe at the time, and again, Kafka's stuff and so forth. But nowadays, of course, we've got some retro stories where we're doing this. If I had been walking around New York in 1900, what would I be feeling? The City Beautiful, which just came out and was excellent, had a lot of that.
Cool. What about musicals? Jim Rebhan asks. The 1956 musical and the original book, Damn Yankees, were written and produced by Jews. Do you have thoughts about this?
That's another book, but absolutely. I've got a friend doing classes on Jewish influence in musicals, which this class has been going the entire pandemic, and he hasn't run out of stuff, because how much have Jews influenced musicals? A lot. And this goes from giant metaphors to little tiny cute mentions. Yeah. So I haven't actually seriously looked into it unless it was a sci-fi or fantasy musical. Wizard of Oz has Jewish influence. Yeah, on and on it goes. But yes. How could we make the Jewish Princess Disney movie? Yes, I have seen many articles online asking that question. And I've seen suggestions from Queen Esther as an obvious thing to adapt to something like All of a Kind Family. And yes, and nobody seems to have a perfect answer to that question. Often in the world of multiculturalism and let's get one of every kind of Barbie in the box and let's make sure all these different groups are represented, Jews end up being not represented, as we might have observed. And again, I'm reading many articles about this concept of when we say own voices and we want to hear from everybody, where are the Jewish books in this? And I am seeing a lot of Jewish books came out. I saw a question about sci-fi for PJ Library. The answer is they are actively looking, and my own collection of children's Jewish science fiction has been on hold for quite a while. But yes, there is some out there, and if you contact me, I could try to get a list together. But I want my book to be published. It's been on the table for 2 years. Well, we all have problems.
Thank you, Valerie. We hope that your book is published too. Maybe if I don't see any other burning questions in the chat, if I missed something, Valerie, please jump in. If not, I'm wondering if you wanted to tell us just a little bit more about, when we talked about comic books earlier, and just the idea of Jews inventing comic books, and sort of how that came to be, and where you think that has brought us.
Yeah, I believe it was Max Gaines. It was either Charlie Gaines or Max Gaines. They were a father and son, and they each made huge strides in comic book history, who said, hey, why don't we staple together a bunch of comic strips, because comic strips existed in the newspaper, and hand them out as a free promo, and it'll be a comic book. And oh my gosh, everybody loved it. And then he tried selling it for a few cents, and everybody loved that, and it sold out like mad. And then we're starting to do all of these pretty much pulp stories. We've got a lot of detective characters, and we've got a lot of spies, and again, World War II is right on the horizon, and a couple of Jewish teenagers when it wasn't Friday, because on Friday mom needed to use the challah board to make her challah, so they couldn't draw pictures using it, came up with Superman, who again was quite autobiographical, and it took off, and that was the first superhero comic. And then of course everybody wanted something kind of like Superman because everyone was buying this. And ironically, one of the big ones, Batman, also had Jewish creators, and Batman doesn't seem that Jewish, although somebody for my upcoming anthology just wrote a big fat essay about this and came up with some stuff. But he is so waspy that he seems to be overcompensating, just like, as some people have pointed out, somebody calling himself Clark Kent seems to be hiding himself really obviously in plain sight. And so we end up with these fascinating Jewish metaphors under the surface, about which other people have already written 500 pages. Can I find you a children's book with a Black Jewish character? Yes. The Unfinished Corner comic book does. Basically, you can get lists because PJ Library and all the children's book lists have been actively looking for, can we get some multicultural Jews? Can we get anybody who isn't from the number one obvious group? And so they've been making so many lists every time somebody does come out with something. Our Crumb there's an entire genre of comics with an X, the indie comics from San Francisco around the 70s. And there were feminist ones, there were satirical ones. And yes, I left out that entire genre, although I do have a chunk on that in the upcoming book. And thank you for posting the Jewish Black children's books, much appreciated.
All right, well, thank you so much, Valerie. This has been really interesting and informative, and given us lots of things to look into and read. And we look forward to continuing to learn from you and everything that you publish.
This was a delight.
Thank you, everybody, for attending and joining us tonight. And you can look forward to receiving our follow-up email in the next couple of days with the resources that were mentioned, and then resources that you can borrow from the library. Take care.